Good evening and welcome back to Astrology in the News. I'm Eden Maybon. Tonight's top story, the Queen Victoria II of England celebrates her 70th Jubilee at the age of 96, though she hasn't been feeling well, and she was scheduled to attend one of the Jubilee's main events at St. Paul's Cathedral. And because she has been feeling discomfort, she has now pulled out from that event. Let's take a look at Her Highness's birth chart and transits to see what is going on at the moment. I actually want to take the time back to the last lunar eclipse that happens on June the 16th. So we'll go back here a few days, and you can see that the lunar eclipse occurs pretty much directly over Her Highness's ascendant ruler, Saturn. So this is quite interesting. We turn the jewel in two ways for this signification. Saturn is also the exaltation lord of the 10th house. So Her Highness has this moment of accomplishment and success denoted by Saturn being that exaltation lord at the moment that the eclipse is occurring, a moment of timing. But there is also the signification of, because Saturn is the ascendant ruler, that the timing speaks to potential health issues. And of course, the Queen is quite elderly at this point, 96 years old. So nobody is really sure how much longer she can make it at 96, which is why she has already had to refrain from attending the event that is happening tomorrow on Friday at St. Paul's Cathedral. Another notable mention for Her Highness's transits at the moment is we are also seeing Saturn in the sky form a square to Her Highness's ascendant ruler, Saturn again. So we have another ascendant ruling connection here. In Her Highness's chart, you can see she has a Mars conjunct Jupiter natally. Well, as you probably know, this is an aspect that we are receiving right now, currently in the sky in the sign of Aries. So there is a little bit of an auspicious timing where there's kind of a return of a similar aspect to her natal chart. And that just speaks to kind of greater cycles of life maybe coming to an interesting completion. If we now jump to the current day, today, June the 2nd, we see that the sun is currently in Her Highness's 6th house of health. So there is a little bit of another health kind of connotation with the sun being in that 6th house. We can also see that Mercury, which is stationing retrograde, is forming an opposition to her ascendant ruler. Again, we have this connection back to the ascendant ruler. So that is the transits that you could sort of see what she is dealing with right now. Now, I should mention that I am actually a huge admirer of the Queen. And one thing that I've always found very interesting about her chart is that she has the moon in the sign of Leo in Her Highness's 8th house here. The moon was a planet that signifies the Queen or the goddess. And Leo is a sign that signifies the king. Having the moon in Leo in the 8th house speaks to how her father, the late king, passed on the title of royalty to her. She inherited the kingdom, which is quite interesting. So you definitely see some very queenly aspects natally in Her Highness's chart. Another one of these is that you see Venus exalted in the sign of Pisces in her 3rd house, the house of goddess and the house of the queen. So that is very interesting. And right now, Venus is also the domicile ruler of her 10th whole sign house. So again, you see this ripening of culmination for success with Venusian things. She's being recognized as being a great queen at her 70th Jubilee. So that is what we're seeing for the Queen right now. I hope that she makes a good recovery. My wishes and love are with her. In other news, there was another shooting at a hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma today. A man walks in and begins shooting people on the 2nd floor. Apparently, he was after his doctor who had recently performed a back operation on him, and he claims to have tried to get pain medication and been refused. So eventually he took a violent course of action into the hospital, ends up killing his doctor and 4 people in total before killing himself. This time the police were jumping over anything and everything to get in there as fast as they could. But let's take a look at the local chart of this area, Tulsa, Oklahoma. I want to share this with you. You can see now that, again, we have still Mars and Jupiter still within that ancient 3-degree orb aspect of influence here. But this time we see it playing out in the 7th house. This was a house that was associated with death, finality, open enemies, things like this. So you could definitely see a planet of death in the house of death. And this aspect was also performing a superior or dominant square back to the moon in the 10th house place of the public. So this sort of speaks to this aspect that has still been just clinging on, and in my opinion, represents most of the violent actions, the violent shootings that we've been seeing out in the world right now at large. This is just a very, very powerful aspect. And because Mars, a malefic, is involved, you tend to see this with the more mentally unstable people expressing this through very violent means. One other thing about this that I find significant, you also have Saturn here in Aquarius forming that square back to Mercury that is set to station and turn direct. So again, we have this dominant upon the 10th Mars-like aspect from Saturn, a god that is also has to do with violent actions. And obviously the 8th has to do with death in certain circumstances. But the 5th can sometimes relate to drug use. And there's an interesting thing with Saturn representing perhaps suffering. So you have in the local environment of this chart, you have there's some kind of suffering that happens in this place where there's a connection sometimes to drugs, or at least the alleviation moving towards some kind of joy or fun. And while Saturn is there, you can't have any kind of relief from the pain. So that domination seems to have made an interesting connection back to Mercury. And why are we looking at Mercury? Because Mercury is the location's 12th house ruler of Virgo here, so a place of hospitals. So I'm looking to that one to sort of signify this a little bit. One final significant thing about this is you actually see that there is an antitia forming between the sun and the moon. Now, what you have to do to figure out if you have an antitia is you have to take 11 and subtract 30 from 11, and then you have to add that to the 7. If it's around 30 degrees, what that is suggesting is that there is a secretive conjunction between the sun and the moon. Now, this only happens between the solstice and equinox points. So between Gemini and Cancer and Sagittarius and Capricorn for the solstice points. And it happens again between Virgo and Libra for a contra antitia. And we have between Aries and Pisces for another contra antitia. So we have 2 contra antitia locations in the chart, and we have 2 antitia locations. Antitias are a hidden form of a conjunction. It's a conjunction that you can't see in the chart unless you do the math. But because they share the same light on both sides of these cardinal points of the year, it is said that they were like a secretive antitia, a similar energy that you could say eclipses have to do with, because eclipses are the eclipsing of one of the lights in a sense. So because we're seeing an antitia between the lights, we've just had an eclipse between the lights. In my mind, you could sort of say that this seems to be kind of almost like an interesting form of a ripple or a repeat. Or in the Matrix, they had that moment where if you see the cat walking by twice, they say it was like a glitch in the Matrix. It's a little bit for me like kind of a deja vu of the eclipse. And eclipses have this interesting thing that happens where they tend to ripple out. They tend to be very powerful and they send big waves out. And time is a little bit strange with eclipses. So in my mind, I feel like this may have been a moment where there was a little bit of a dark eclipse energy sort of reforming in the current moment. And it was happening between the 10th house place and the 9th house place, which is a very public place. So that is what I'm seeing for this shooting. Mostly, I think it boils down again to, unfortunately, the violence of Mars and Jupiter being in Aries. And this time it played out in a house that has to do with death and finality. So for the shooter's representation of reality, he must have been thinking, this is going to be, I'm going to openly become the enemy of this situation and take life and death into my own hands and create some kind of finality to the situation. And then it relates back to this Saturn potentially with the suffering in the 5th, needing some kind of drug that will take away the suffering and bring back some good feeling in the body. So unfortunately, we had another incident. Quite frankly, I'm getting really tired of even hearing these incidences take place, and I hope that they will stop very soon. There's been a lot of news talking about what we should do with the gun rights for people in Canada and in America lately. One interesting side note, I think, is also if we turn the jewel a little bit with this Mars-Jupiter aspect, Jupiter can represent law. Mars can represent the beginning or inception of things, and Aries is a sign that has to do with the beginning or inception of things. So we could see, due to this surge of violence in the society, we could maybe see new laws will potentially be announced at this moment, especially when we have Mercury here stationing to turn direct pretty much at this same time right now. So there could be the announcements. And I think I also saw or heard something today talking about how we could maybe implement some artificial intelligence in schools as a measure to catch and detect guns entering the school area as early as possible within seconds, and that could alert the authorities. So there's interesting things happening with this ripple effect that is causing news items to surface right now at the moment. And for the final news segment tonight, I'm sure you've already heard by now that the case between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, the verdict came back yesterday on Wednesday, and it was pretty much a landslide victory for Johnny Depp. So I actually predicted this wrong because Venus had moved into the sign of Taurus. I thought, well, there is some dignity that is ramping up for Venusian things. But as I did mention, it might be up to each person to decide which of these two people that were against each other actually represents more of a Venusian quality. I might argue now that Johnny may have a bigger star quality. One thing I've been thinking about is that Venus is the third brightest thing in the night sky, apart from the sun and the moon. And then in the next line of ranking for brightness, it becomes Venus. So Venus has a little bit of a luminary quality, you could say, where there's a star power because the sun represents fame oftentimes, and Venus being so bright and having to do with artistic things and Venusian things and sort of celebrity status. You could almost combine those two when it comes to Venus at times. Right now, Venus is actually very bright in the night sky and prominent. You could almost say that Johnny Depp may here have represented the person that had a higher status of celebrity, a higher reputation of status as a bright individual. And it looked like Amber essentially wasn't, telling the truth in most cases, or as at least that is what the general consensus of the people seems to think. As a side note, one very interesting thing about this case is that in ancient astrology, when planets formed aspects to each other, the ancients said that they were testifying, as in testifying in a court of law. And when it came to degree-based aspects, that was. Whole sign aspects were different, but degree-based aspects were said to testify to each other. There were 7 jury members on this panel, and they came back with the verdict after hearing the testimony. I want to actually bring up the chart for Fairfax, Virginia here, because that is where the trial took place. This, you'll notice, is pretty much the same chart that we see for the last segment. But in this situation, you see this Jupiter-Mars conjunction that is happening in the 8th place. Now, this is a place that has to do with karmatic ties, or ties between what is taken from us sometimes as a fine or penalty and what is given to us. But how do we see Johnny as the sort of ruler, hands down ruler of this verdict? Well, sometimes very simply, you don't have to make it complicated. You see that the sun is in the 10th whole sign place of this area for the moment around the time that the verdict came back. The 10th house is a place that has to do with judges, very much. So planets in this house are receiving judgment or making judgment. This place was the throne of the sun. Essentially, it was the highest point of culmination. So you have a high judgment that is occurring at this exact moment, and the judgment is speaking to more masculine significations because it's the sun here. You do have Amber in the 11th house, represented here by the moon, and the moon is actually in good dignity. But again, you see that there was a square forming between the moon and Mars is a malefic. So I think in this circumstance, there probably are 100 ways to analyze it, but in terms of the mundane aspects, you simply have a masculine solar planet in the 10th house in a place that represents success. You have the moon, which is also in a pretty good house, in a pretty good dignity, but receiving a very difficult aspect from Mars from the 8th. So it looks like that she is the one that receives the penalty. I also want to take a look at Johnny Depp's natal chart and share this with you guys, just because I think it is so interesting here. So here we have Johnny Depp's birth chart. Remember that a birth chart is really the potential or the promise. It's not always that we get, if you have the sun in the 11th house, it's not always that you might have some good fortune around groups or friends. It's just that if you have the sun in the 11th house, there are times in your life where you may have that good fortune, or you will have that good fortune promised and come to fruition. It's not always that the garden is always bringing forth the promise of the natal chart. But I think it's very, very fascinating. This is a moment where you do sort of see that having the sun in the 11th house, a place that promises to bring eventual success up to the 10th. Remember, in the Fairfax chart for the moment of the verdict, that the sun was in the 10th whole sign place. So you can see this movement where the sun is representing Johnny, a masculine figure, and in Johnny's chart, he has a chart that promises some kind of eventual ruling that has a success or achievement built into it. So I think that that is very fascinating. One other very fascinating thing is that Mr. Depp has a natal Jupiter in Aries, which we see right now in the sky. Also, we do see a sun in Gemini at the current moment, and Mr. Depp shares that. We also see Mercury in Taurus that is stationing to turn direct right now, and Mr. Depp also has that in his natal chart. So you have these correlations between timing. You can sort of see how the promise or the fruition of some of Johnny Depp's natal promised planets seem like they're speaking out right now and saying, you're going to win. What else can we see from Mr. Depp's chart? Well, he does have this Saturn in the 7th house, making this square, this dominant square back to Venus here. This sort of speaks to having a difficult relationship. Saturn, the ruler of the 7th house, and in the 7th house, sometimes this can mean a very long-lasting relationship that really stands the test of time, but it can also mean that there could be a lot of suffering and a lot of conflict brought back to Venus, a signator of relationships, just in the natural sense of Venusian things. So that is one thing that is interesting, but I think because Mr. Depp has Saturn natally in the 7th house, the 7th house was also a place of lawsuits. So having a dignified Saturn in that place sort of speaks to the fact that he could shake out very well for lawsuits. So we could have looked at this earlier and maybe predicted that. But in any case, it was quite a wild ride to see this whole thing play out. It was pretty much the cycle of Mercury going through its shadow, turning retrograde. And as Mercury is stationing direct, this is when the verdict is announced. And this whole news item that has been very prominent for the world right now, Mercury representing the news, this planet now begins to slow down and stop and then reverse course and go direct. So this definitely signifies this thing that we've been tuned into becoming announced at the moment. This is when we find out what the verdict is going to be, and that is exactly what happened. So it was an interesting ride seeing how things were going to shake out. But of course, there are a lot of consequences that come out of this that is being talked about right now on Amber's side. I think she is going to appeal, and so we'll have to see what happens with it. But thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed this segment of Astrology in the News for June 2nd, 2022, and I'll see you real soon. Take care. Bye.